Hi, everyone. We're going to talk about something about the American Revolution that they didn't teach you about in school. And since we're celebrating our independence, this is something that maybe you would like to know more about. And I know it was fascinating for me because I had no idea. The only one I recall hearing any sort of spy activity was poor Nathan Hale, and we will get to him very, very shortly. But here we go. Okay, now this was what happened in Massachusetts in 1775. The British authorities, led by General Thomas Gage, he was the military governor of Boston and surrounding Massachusetts, and he knew that the Patriots were assembling weapons and munitions somewhere outside of Boston, and he sent out two teams of spies to try to find them. And these were not trained operatives because Britain had had a secret service since Queen Elizabeth's time, by that point, about 200 years. So they were not trained people, and it shows. And I'm showing one of them here, Count Rumford, who later on in life actually wound up making baking powder, and it was sold in stores for quite some time, and even a cookbook. But he was a young British officer, and he and another man went out looking for this in February of 1775, and the first tavern they stopped in, they were recognized by a waitress who had seen them in uniform in Boston, and she had alerted the publican, that they were up to no good. And so they sort of had to talk their way out of that and keep moving. Now, in another team who went out about the same time, they also had very bad luck in a tavern because one of them asked for a cup of tea, or actually what they would do, a dish of tea. And that was the most clear way in those days you could express your political preference. If you were a king's man, you wanted tea. If you were not, you wanted coffee. Even John Adams once wrote to his wife that he had gone to try a case and rode 35 miles, which was an all-day thing in those days. And he asked the landlady if she would give him a dish of tea. And she said that we had forsworn tea, but she could make him as much coffee as he wanted. And that's how he knew he was in the right place, so to speak. Now, people were already suspicious of these two guys because, first of all, they were strangers, and they had a cover story saying they were surveyors who were trying to uh, work on the roads, survey the roads, which happened very infrequently at best back then, and certainly not in February. And when the other guy asked for tea, his friend had to cover for him because everyone gave them a very hard look. And he covered by ordering a New England, which was rum and molasses, which was a proper Yankee drink. And that's how they got out of there. But even then, they were plagued with bad luck. They were trying to walk through a town in the middle of the night, and everyone was asleep except for a mother who was tending a sick child, and they walked right by her window, and she immediately alerted her husband, and the whole town was in full cry. And so it was very dicey for both teams, but one of the teams did have some luck. What they found was they told a guy on the road that they were looking for work because could make gunsmiths, and he directed them to Concord, not realizing he was talking to British agents. But in the meantime, that was valuable information. They went back to Boston, both teams, and uh, but they were also being spied upon and very closely watched. And you might ask, by whom? And people like Paul Revere. That's he even wrote that they would take turns watching everything. However, they made their mistakes as well. One of the things that they did was that everybody in town over the age of 4 knew that they would meet for their meetings in the Green Dragon Tavern. And so it was pretty an amateur bit all the way around in some ways. Now, here's something many years later, around 1798, Paul wrote some things, and this is, he said, we frequently took turns 2 by 2 to watch the soldiers. They saw boats belonging to the transports were all launched, and they were getting ready to load with men. And so they were getting very suspicious. They knew something was up, and this was April of 1775. So this is what they did next. That when they learned that the British Army was to march to Concord on April 18th, this is how they let people know outside of town what was going to happen. And here's the lantern, and you'll see what they did with it. This is it. You remember in school, 1 if by land, 2 if by sea. Well, what happened was Revere and Samuel Prescott, they rode across the Charles River, and they would look, see how many lanterns would be hung in the Old North Church steeple, which was then the tallest place in town. And 1 lantern meant that the army would march by land over Boston Neck, which was a very narrow road to the mainland. And 2 lanterns meant that they would row across the Charles River and head to Concord through Charlestown. And this is what I'm talking about the neck. See all of this filled in. This was all filled in after the war. You may perhaps, if you've ever visited Boston, heard them call a neighborhood the Back Bay. Well, that's it, because as you see, it would be very hard to get an army across that little narrow road. And here's Old North Church, which you can still see. They actually have a cool thing in Boston. They have red bricks inserted into the sidewalk. All you do is follow the bricks all over the north end, and it takes you past the church and all the other places. So it's really cool. And so Revere, Prescott, and Dawes rode to war and the Patriot leaders. However, Revere got caught, and he was too well known. He got sent back into town, but the others got out. And so the message got around, and literally hundreds of men from every surrounding town started running to Lexington with guns in their hands, which is part of our American mythology, but it was also very real. And there's been some speculation if there was an operative on the inside. And Thomas Gage was married to Margaret Kemble Gage, and she, unlike her husband, was an American. She was an American-born, a native Bostonian. She was on speaking terms with all the rebel leaders, and so she had motive, and she also had opportunity, as the spy activities were directed in her home. Now, whether she's so or not, but one source I used, the Society of the Cincinnati, which is a special group that people who are descended from George Washington's officers. So they're even more exclusive than the sons and the daughters of the American Revolution. They believed on their website, and also a New England historian wrote a few years ago that he believed that. So it's an open field right now. We don't really know. All we do know is that before Gage was removed and sent back to England, he sent Margaret on ahead, 6 months ahead of him, and she never returned to her native land. Now, what happened, Boston was completely surrounded, and General Howe was in Boston, and he could defend it because he had trained troops. Everybody else had untrained militia. But George Washington had this brilliant stroke. He actually sent Henry Knox, a local bookseller, believe it or not, to travel all the way across Massachusetts into New York State and haul the cannons from Fort Ticonderoga, which is still standing. You can actually go and see it all the way across through the wilderness. And he poised them on the bluffs overlooking of Dorchester Heights, looking down at the town and seeing that it was untenable, how loaded all of his troops onto transports, and they sailed to Halifax, Nova Scotia, to meet a fleet that was coming from England to put down our revolution. And so the next logical move for Washington was to bring his troops south to America's second largest city, New York. And if you look at this, you'll see an awful lot of activity between British and Americans in the New York, New Jersey area. And we'll cover that a little later too. Now, this was New York in 1776, and it wasn't very, very large. Anyone who knows New York would know this is where it starts in the Wall Street area. This is Broadway. This is where City Hall is. And this dark shape here is what was burned before the British took over the town, and which they did so after the disastrous Battle of Brooklyn, where Washington was forced to hand over New York for the rest of the war to the British. And it actually was a very serious fire, which the British claim that was set by the Americans. And of course, we know from today's that in the present war in Europe, one side says one thing, another side says another thing. So that's unresolved. And now here's where Nathan Hale comes in. Now, Nathan Hale, I call him a hero wasted because he had undeniable courage, but he didn't have the knowledge he needed. But Washington was so desperate for news after the British took over the town to send him in anyway. And this is where it all went wrong. He volunteered in public in front of his fellow officers. He had no alias, absolutely none. What he did have was his own diploma from Yale, his own name, which was something of a cover because, after all, a schoolmaster would be looking for work in September. And that gave him a plausible reason to be there because most people, well-to-do people, they were educated at home, private tutor. He had no safe house in town because he had never been to New York before. He knew no one in town at all. And he also didn't know a code. He had no way of trying to get the information he learned out of the city except to bring it himself, which he tried to do. And according to what we know, he was caught in no man's land between where the Americans were in round 60th Street, present 60th Street, and where the British were. So he was captured. They found his notes on him because he had written them down very bad, and he was supposedly ordered to be hanged without trial. Now, this is something else. This story is very, very shaky in its provenance because the Library of Congress in the National Archives, they published this great magazine called Prologue, and they did a great article about it. And this is what they said. So much of what has been written about his fateful mission is based on inference, guesswork, and flights of imagination. And two former CIA station operatives who directed other spies and had been spies themselves, in their retirement, they became historians, and they went through all of this, and they believed that there's just not enough information to be totally sure of exactly what happened. And we don't even know exactly where he was hanged. This DAR plaque is conveniently on the 44th Street and Vanderbilt Place location of the Yale Club. However, the most plausible location, a lot of accounts seem to place it in where the former Beekman Country Mansion was on East River on 51st and First Avenue, but we really don't know. Now, Washington learned a very, very hard lesson, and he was never going to put agents in jeopardy again if he could help it. And this is a house that was used on Long Island by one members of a unique put together spy ring, because Washington didn't do it. They just did it themselves, called the Culper ring. And basically it all worked because a Robert Townsend, he had come from Setauket on Long Island, and he had a store in the city. And because of that store, he actually had all this stuff that the British would come in and buy, and he'd hear talk, and he'd hang out in the taverns, and he'd hear them talk. And I mean, they totally accepted him. That everyone assumed that since he did not flee after the Battle of Brooklyn, like many New Yorkers did, that he was a King's man. Well, he was not. And he actually set up this great ring that operated throughout the entire war. Now, they used a form of what they call passive espionage, because civilians could freely move through the lines in those days, and they were mostly interrogated by both sides to see what they had seen. And but it was also a way to direct them to give misinformation. And the Culper ring made the most of it. And this is how it worked. Townsend would be right here in the city at his store. Austin Rowe would bring in vegetables and fruits and other goods, farm goods, to the store. Townsend would give him all of his information, and another member, Caleb Brewster, would row it across Long Island Sound to American held Connecticut. And from there, it would be sent to Washington. And it was, very, very cumbersome, but it did work. And they even had a woman member, Anna Strong, because the information to be rowed across had to be put in a series of several coves on the North Shore. And in order for Brewster to know which one the information was hidden in, Anna would hang up a petticoat to indicate that there was information that had to be transported. And then she would hang up handkerchiefs to tell them that it was it would be in the third cove, 5 would be in the 5th cove, and Brewster would go and retrieve it. Now, here was a very bold American spy, because, as you know, there's a lot of bureaucratic paperwork in Army, and Louis Costigan was an American who was captured in 1777, and he was allowed to stay in New York City until both armies had agreed for a changeover. And usually it was almost like modern 20th century spy novels with the Soviet Union. Usually we gave him somebody we held, and they gave us somebody they held in some sort of place. And he was under what they call parole. And this was generally extended to officers like him. And parole, you gave your solemn word that you would do nothing to harm your adversary until you return to your own unit. And when finally all the paperwork came through in early 1779, he was asked to stay 4 months more to gather information. And, by then he was a part of the scenery. Everybody saw him every day. He hung out in the same taverns, he walked the streets. He wasn't a spy because he was in full continental uniform. And he picked up the stuff, and he nobody seemed to be noticed that he should have already been gone, but they let him stay. And finally, when he did leave, he had a whole bunch of information with him. Now, George Washington really got into spying and actually had a natural bent for it. When told that there were British sympathizers posing as his troops, they wanted to court martial and hang them, shoot them, whatever. But he said, no, leave them in place. He would make sure that they would be able to transmit information. However, it would be the wrong information. There was enough detail to make it sound plausible, but it was wrong nonetheless. And I think one of his greatest strokes was to keep uh, Sir Henry Clinton's army holed up in New York City by threatening and to attack the city if Sir Henry moved his troops and take it back from the British. And New York City was quite a prize to the British Army. They definitely didn't want to give it up. And what he did is that he started riding with his officers above the New Jersey Palisades where everyone could see them. And they would be using telescopes, and they would be using maps and protractors and giving every single indication of planning a major military attack. And also, he fed the false story to everyone going into the city of that an attack was in the offing. And while Sir Henry sat waiting to defend New York City, Washington was able to move his army quietly south to Yorktown, Virginia, to meet with the French fleet to bottle the British into Yorktown and overwhelm them with superior numbers, forcing their surrender. And basically, that ended the war. It took 2 more years for negotiation to work everything out. And the British didn't actually leave New York until November 25th, 1783. But in 1781, after Yorktown, basically the war was over due to Washington's trick. And he also set up reliable men that he knew could actually help him. And one of them was John Jay. And he's memorialized today in the college, the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. And he worked with the Cobra Ring, facilitated everything, and that's him. Now, Enoch Crosby was a very active spy. He mostly operated in his area of Westchester County, and where there were a lot of British loyalist troops. And he even actually pretended to be a sympathizer to join the militias so he could report on them. And but in order to make it look good, Washington published that he was a turncoat to the American cause to make it more believable to the British allies. And some of this required some real, theater magic, so to speak. And he couldn't tell his family what he had been doing. And one day, he got captured by American troops, and they hauled him into camp to see Washington. And I mean, they beat him up and threw him on the ground. So here he is on the ground, all muddy, defeated, in pain. And he looks up and he sees his parents' oldest and dearest friend in the entire world, who lost no time getting back to them to tell them what a disgrace their son was. But after the war, he actually got memorialized by James Fenimore Cooper in a novel called The Spy. And so in the end, everything was made up. His family realized what he had been doing and he became a great hero. Now, there were other, so-called, volunteer spies, and one of them was two brothers named Mesereau, and they used an island off of Staten Island to pick up and drop information because being Staten Islanders, they could take a boat into New York. Uh, it was from Staten Island into the city, pick up information and leave it. And this was what they call in the business a dead drop. And we'll talk more about that a little later. Now, of course, not all the spying activity was around New York. Several things happened further south, and this is an outstanding case. We know about it because Lydia told her daughter all about it, and she wrote it all down. Otherwise, we wouldn't have. And she was a Philadelphia woman whose home happened to be across the street from the British. And what happened was is that she was told that the family had to vacate the house. The British wanted to take the entire house. And she went across the street and complained. And they conceded that they only really needed a private room in which to hold meetings. So they said she and her family, her children could stay, but when they needed the room, she had to let them in, and the entire family had to go upstairs and retire for the night and stay there until they were called for her to lock the door when they were done. Well, one night, she was asked without warning to do this. And so she realized something must be up. And what the British didn't know was when they were having their meeting is that there was one of the walls adjoined a closet, and there was no actual wall there. It was simply wallpaper overlaying. And Lydia supposedly slipped into this closet and could hear everything they said. And she found out that they were planning to row across the Schuylkill River and eliminate Washington's army at White Marsh. And her motive to report on them was that her oldest son was with Washington and was fighting. In fact, she even used to send her younger son to visit his brother, and little things, gossip and things she picked up, she would actually write on a tiny piece of paper and put in a button mold, put cloth over it, and sew it on the front of her younger son's jacket. And this way her older son could retrieve whatever she found out. So she's had sort of eased into spying already, but this was her big score. And there even is some documentation about her, because what happened was an American captain reported seeing a woman, a middle-aged woman, who told him the news that the British were coming over the river, and he didn't get her name, but after all, it wasn't common knowledge, and she would seem like the right gender and right age for her to do that. And she also carried a flour sack, which was a perfect cover because all the flour mills were outside of the city. Everyone in town would go across the river and get some flour and bring it back home. Now, elsewhere, this is in South Carolina, two sisters, Grace and Rachel Martin, their husbands were, of course, fighting for the Americans, and they dressed in their clothing, and they actually stopped a British dispatch rider, and they stole his papers and got them to General Nathaniel Greene. So, I mean, everyone who could just sort of threw themselves into it. Now, of course, the British were not being idle either. And this was their greatest successful operative, Dr. Benjamin Church. Benjamin Church, like Margaret, was a long-lived Bostonian who knew everyone and he literally moved in the highest circles of the Massachusetts state government and the Continental Army. He was even appointed what we would today call the Surgeon General of the Army. So he was in a position to learn an awful lot of information for the British. Now, this is how he got caught. He needed to write to General Gage, and he didn't want to be seen delivering a message to his house or sending a messenger. And he got his mistress to who was traveling to Providence, Rhode Island, to mail the letter from there. And instead of mailing it, she gave it to an old beau of hers who literally sat on it for a couple of weeks. And he consulted one of his friends and saying, what should we do with it? Because he didn't know what was in it. But it did seem peculiar. Why would somebody mail a letter coming from Boston to send back to Boston when they lived there in the first place? And even the girl supposedly wrote to him saying, telling him that the letter had to be mailed and to do what he promised. Finally, he took it to the local committee of correspondence. They opened the letter. They found it was addressed to General Gage, and they found it was written in code. I mean, there was absolutely no question of his guilt. So what happened was he was literally banished from the state of Massachusetts, sent back to Britain, and his ship was lost at sea. So you could say karma is a real biatch in a way. Okay, now here's another thing the British knew, James Moody. I mean, he was probably the most successful British spy, although it was pretty close to once he had to hide in a haystack for 3 days without food or water because everyone was looking for him. But he was so clever that he could really almost get Washington's correspondence largely at will. So he was doing really, really very well. And now let's get to see what some of the espionage practices were. And Dr. Church and others used a variety of methods. And one of the most common was a mask letter, because in it, you wrote what seemed to be like a personal message or a business letter, something very commonplace. But when you put a grid, a special mask of some kind over it, it would actually reveal the real message. And I'll show you what that looked like. I have to give credit to the Clements Library in the University of Michigan. They have an outstanding collection of espionage letters. And this is one in 1777, General Henry Clinton to John Burgoyne. Burgoyne had actually asked for help to armies to meet in central New York because the British were trying to cut the northern states from the southern states through New York State and get control of that. And Clinton basically said that he said he has too small a force to make any effectual diversion in your favor, but I shall try something at of any rate. It may be of use to you. And actually, Clinton didn't move out of, and Burgoyne had to surrender his army to General Benedict Arnold. And after the Battle of Bemis Heights around Saratoga, New York. And that was probably the most momentous battle of the war because it quickened the interest of the French, because they had been watching us very closely. Even at the Battle of Lexington, there were French spies in an inn who observed and reported to their government. And they realized that with a little help, we could actually win this. Now, they didn't care a hang about whether we were independent or not. They wanted payback for British Empire stealing all their Canada possessions and everything. So they were going to help us, and that actually helped us win the war. We could never have done it without them. Now, here's another thing. They would, much like Lydia did, they would write very, 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 very tiny and roll it up and put it into a quill pen, because most people traveled with some sort of correspondence chest, and they would write letters on the road and have them mailed, because there was a post rider network along the main roads between like Boston and Charleston, and you could actually write a letter and leave it in the inn, and it would be sent on. You didn't have to stay there, because in those days the recipient paid the postage, not the sender. So it was pretty easy to do that. Now, here's another deception. You could actually put a message in a hollow silver ball. So if you were caught, you could just swallow it and it would pass harmlessly through your gastrointestinal system. However, it was good not to do this by being observed by the British or by the Americans, because then you would be in a privy under armed guard waiting for the inevitable to happen. And they use ciphers and codes, and they use a lot of number and letter variations. And in a way, we sort of do the same thing with passwords. Supposedly, the best passwords you can use for like email or something are letter number combinations, because they're the hardest to break. And in this particular one, they had a corresponding number. So if you see 679, that's wind. If you see 688, that's wood. Another method that they used was the sender and the receiver would actually have the same book, and the sender would write down the pages, paragraph, numbers. And if you had the same book, you could actually piece together what the message was supposed to be about. So it was pretty good for the time. And this was even, they even had an Enigma machine. And if you remember for World War II, that was an electronic machine that could make endless variations of numbers to form codes. Well, this is a much more primitive version of that, but it was a rotary. You could move all the letters and numbers, and it was very, very clever. And here's dead drops again. Dead drops were usually in agreed upon public spaces that they knew a lot of people would go to. And this is a public well, which was a perfect place because people, especially in New York, that's where they went to get their daily water. They would go with pitchers, fill them up, gas, fill them up, and be constantly coming and going. And, nobody would question why you were there. And here's what they call disappearing ink. And this is a fun thing to do with kids. Anything like lemon or orange juice, you can actually use it as an ink and write it on a piece of paper. And when you hold it over a light bulb, all of a sudden the invisible writing suddenly exposes itself. And that'd be a fun thing to do with your children sometime, children or grandchildren. And Ben Franklin, who spent most of the war in Paris, he used a secret cipher because he was in constant contact with the Congress in Philadelphia, and he needed one because his confidential secretary, who was supposed to have access to everything, was a paid British agent. Now, this was the largest calamity that happened to America. Benedict Arnold became dissatisfied with his role in the Continental Army, and there was a lot of justification for that because he never got the credit he deserved, because other higher ranking people would steal all the things that he accomplished, and he just felt shunted off to the sidelines by being the military commander of West Point because he had been removed as the military commander of Philadelphia, which was a big disgrace. And he felt he was shoved into this backwater. So he finally decided to switch sides to king and country. And here's the triangle. Here's Arnold and his much younger wife, Peggy Shippen Arnold. And Peggy was the daughter of a prominent Philadelphia merchant who was also a loyalist. And you would think that the Americans, when they retook the city, would probably have told them just to leave, but he was so well connected that he was literally too big to fail. And that's where Arnold started to court Peggy, and they got married. Now, here's the other one. This is Major John Andre, who had been on General Howe's staff before the Americans gained control of the city. So he was an old beau of Peggy's. So that puts them in direct connection in order to influence Arnold to surrender West Point. Well, it didn't work. Andre was captured, and like Captain Hale before him, he had incriminating documents he had written down on him, telling the whole plot. And Arnold had to flee and leave his wife and son behind. And this is a very interesting part. Now, this is purely anecdotal, but many, many years later, Aaron Burr told the story that his late wife, Theodosia, they had been living outside of New York City. And what happened is that Peggy had visited them along with joining her husband in the city. And it was in basically the west side around Tribeca, West Village. If you look on a map, you'll see what I'm talking about. And according to Peggy, in order to get out and not be questioned, she literally portrayed herself as a woman deranged by grief. She would cry and moan and tear out her hair. And it was all supposedly pretend to ignore. And the Americans, they hastily got rid of her before they had a chance to ask her, what did Peggy know and when did she know it? And here's the assessment, because when Arnold fled, George Washington, who was expecting to meet with Arnold, was puzzled, and he sent one of his adjutants, Alexander Hamilton. And this was what he wrote back. Here has just been unfolded at this place a scene of the blackest treason. Arnold has fled to the enemy. Andre, the British spy, is in our prison as a spy. I mean, there was just no going back now. But there's a further story about Andre, and he actually wound up in Washington Irving's The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, where Ichabod was fascinated by the stories the old women told. And this is one of the quotes. It said, many dismal tales were told about funeral trains and mourning cries and wailings heard and seen about the great tree where the unfortunate Major Andre was taken and which stood in the neighborhood. And that was the tree where he was hanged. And here's something else. This was something that actually happened on Halloween in 1801. This was actually a New York Times article written 80 years later. And it said that the tree Andre was hanged from was actually hit by a bolt of lightning and split in two. And this tree was 29 feet in circumference and over 100 feet in height. So it was very, very big tree. But this is the real eerie part. said it is a rather singular coincidence that the news of Arnold's death arrived at Greensburg the same day on which the lightning destroyed this tree. I mean, talk about Revolutionary War haunting. Now, we also had one more double agent. Rivington was the editor of New York's Tory Gazette while it was still in British hands. And he probably started out as a loyal King's man, but it was getting more and more obvious, especially after 1778, when the French started to show up with weapons and troops and ships, that maybe the British hold on the United States was not so secure, because Burgoyne's army had just surrendered, and we were taking care of Cornwallis's in Virginia. So gradually he began to sort of swing by our cause, and he probably knew Robert Townsend. And so maybe some sort of persuasion. I don't know. There's very little we do know, but eventually it came out that he did help. But one thing was, his cover was so deep that it wasn't until 1959 that a historian verified that he had indeed actually assisted the American cause. And we even actually have a record, which is very rare, because I mean, most people who spied, they didn't write their stuff down, because it was too dangerous to do while they were doing it. And after the war, I don't know, maybe they felt people weren't interested. But this is a man named Isaac Barker. He actually spied on British troop movements in Rhode Island, and he actually asked for a pension, and that's his application right there. And the last betrayal, after Cornwallis surrendered at Yorktown, he discovered that his spy was a double agent, actually working for Washington. And when he found out, he exclaimed to us, says, "Oh, you rogue!" So he was really very, very angry. I mean, the final betrayal. And if you want to read more about it, we have these books in the library called George Washington's Secret Spy War, which is a really cool book, and Spies of the Revolution. And this is sort of a general one, and it's sort of written more middle school level, but it's still very interesting. And eventually the war ended, and through a combination of dedicated people who took up spying to help their country for liberty, and French help, we actually managed to literally pull it off. So I hope everyone enjoyed this very brief and almost forgotten view of what was happening to secure a free and independent America. Thank you very much.